Yo, what's up guys? With My Hero Academia having just ended and Jujutsu Kaisen probably ending very soon as well, there's been some talk about what the next generation of manga is going to look like. And with its second arc having just concluded, I want to make the case for Kagurabachi. First, from a non-spoiler perspective for those who have not read the series, and then, when it comes up, I'll provide a spoiler warning. We'll dive into some spoilers so I can give some deeper insight into some of the thoughts that I have on this second arc, and hopefully give you some interesting literary analysis to go along with it. That being said, if you are caught up and you just want to get into my more detailed discussion about the Rakuzaichi arc, check for the timestamps probably in the description of this video, and feel free to skip ahead because there is a lot that I want to talk about. Anyways, let's get right into it. Before talking about anything story substance related, I just want to say though, the art in this manga, in my opinion, is stunning. From the very beginning, the one thing that has been pretty consistently top-notch in my opinion has been the art. I won't be showing any panels in this video for potential copyright reasons, unfortunately, so we won't dwell on this topic for too long, but if you are a sucker for good art, I think that alone is reason enough to give this series a try because there are some truly gorgeous panels, and the action sequences have some very cool moments that are conveyed very beautifully. And if we're having a discussion about which series can carry the torch for the next 5 to 10 years, however long the series ends up going, I think art is a part of that conversation, especially if it ends up getting an anime adaptation. You always hear people saying this anime or that anime is carried by the animation, which, you know, I understand that sentiment, but also people tend to gravitate toward things that are visually pleasing, and I think Kagurabachi checks that box and will lend itself to a potentially very visually pleasing anime adaptation should that happen eventually. Of course, the manga itself is gorgeous in my opinion and worth checking out just for that, but I figured I'd mention a potential anime adaptation just because I think there are some sequences that have very high potential if it were to be put into motion, because the fights in the series are pretty fast paced and a lot of the characters are moving pretty quickly. And all this is not to say that Kagurabachi doesn't have a good story, because I think it does. In fact, I think the art of a lot of the recent chapters is outstanding, but I also think that those moments are genuinely really well built up. That being said, I do think it's fair to say that the series does start off a tad slow, and the premise is nothing too out of the ordinary. The motivation of the main character, Chihiro, is nothing anyone hasn't seen before in shonen or media in general, and the start of the series won't necessarily hook you with the craziest plot twist of all time, or a revolutionary premise, or the most emotionally gut-wrenching scene that makes you immediately love the main characters. That's not to say I didn't enjoy the early parts of Kagurabachi, because I did. I think the start of the series is just fine, but I do think it's a bit of a slow burn. That being said, it's been very, very rewarding sticking with the series since the beginning, and I urge you to not give up on it within the first handful of chapters if you do intend to give it a try. I think part of what makes the first few chapters feel a bit more slow is the fact that it's kind of episodic as the main characters collect information that eventually progresses the plot. With a villain of the week type of dynamic, and meeting all of these new characters that you don't necessarily care for. Once you get past the first, I would say 7 or so chapters though, the story becomes more focused and the direction becomes much more clear. And from that point on, it really begins to pick up steam. These names won't mean too much for those who haven't read the series yet, but the introduction of characters such as Char and Sojo quickly add a level of emotional investment to the story that wasn't initially there in my opinion. Sojo in particular was a character who I was surprised to end up liking as much as I did. And by and large, I think thus far, the series' ability to quickly and effectively give characterization and allow you to care for a character is one of its biggest strengths. And for those who will stick around for the rest of this video, trust me, we'll talk extensively about characterization in the spoiler portion of this video. This strength in characterization and character development is why by the end of the first arc, while I was not completely blown away by the series yet, it was definitely starting to earn my trust, and I was at a point where I was invested into seeing what would come next. And oh my god, what came next has truly shattered my expectations. While the premise was originally relatively simple, I think the plot is at a point that is pretty interesting due to a combination of effective world building and strong characterization. On that note, the characters are great, with the cast being filled with likable characters and engaging and, thus far, diverse villains. And I already gushed about it earlier, but the action combined with the art has led to some truly incredible looking fights that amplifies the already emotionally resonant storytelling. The plot does slow down for a bit with the end of the first arc and the beginning of the second arc, but that's standard stuff. It's not a knock on the series at all. It's definitely something that I felt reading it week to week, but if you're reading it all at once, which I did do when I was working on this video, I actually found a lot about it that I thought was enjoyable. Part of the effective characterization I was talking about comes from what I think is genuinely charming dialogue, amidst even moments of heavy exposition. Granted, I know those moments are not everyone's cup of tea, but even so, I think it's worth it for the payoff when you reach the climax of the arc. So yeah, if you are watching this and you have not read Kagurabachi yet, I think this series is peak, and I really think you should give it a shot. Alright, from this point on, spoiler warning. The rest of this video is gonna contain spoilers up to chapter 44 of Kagurabachi, which if for some reason you're somehow watching this in the future and there's already an anime adaptation out, this is the end of the second arc. Alright, I want to talk about a lot of things, but the overarching theme of this video is going to be taking a deeper dive into Hakuri's character during the Rakuzaichi arc, specifically how it relates to the arc's overarching themes on socialization and traditional family dynamics, and also talk a little bit about why I think it's effective and why I really enjoyed it. There's a lot I want to talk about, but let's start small and expand on a topic from the previous section, specifically how I found enjoyment in the early parts of the Rakuzaichi arc in spite of the heavy exposition due to Hokazono, in my opinion, doing a pretty good job of adding personality to the dialogue in subtle ways. Since the strength of the characterization is going to be a common theme throughout this video as we take a deeper dive into Hakuri's character, I figured this would be a good way to set the tone of that discussion. Chapters 26 to 28 came to mind while rereading because it's a very dialogue-heavy string of chapters as Chihiro and gang, mostly Chihiro and Shiba, are trying to figure out how the storehouse works. In spite of that, there are fun character moments, such as in chapter 26, where Shiba tries cheering Hakuri up by offering him ice cream, only for him to decline and for Char to chime in and say she wants ice cream. It plays into the gag of Char's desire of always wanting to eat, while at the same time giving us insight into Hakuri's psyche. Same with chapter 28, and how we have Chihiro and Shiba giving us exposition, while Hakuri, Char, and Hinao are playing in the background. But it's interspersed with moments of them calling Hakuri over, and it's just funny to me seeing Hakuri do all of these fun, whimsical things in the background, only to come jogging in to offer help as soon as he's called. I also think it's interesting though, because Hakuri's feelings of ineptitude are shown visually by how he's pushed to the background of these panels, literally interacting with the side characters as the main characters progress the plot. But Chihiro and Shiba are almost literally pulling him into the spotlight and including him with the main cast, even though he doesn't think he deserves it. With that said, let's start diving into the meat of what we're going to cover, starting with chapter 32, which was, I would say, the first of the chapters in this arc that really elevated the series for me. We were just talking about the development of Hakuri as someone who doesn't believe in himself or his self-worth, and how Chihiro and Shiba still support him in spite of his apparent ineptitude. Chapter 32 is a chapter where after Chihiro and Hakuri get separated by the tree sorcery wall thingy, Chihiro comes face to face with the leader of the Hishaku, and Hakuri comes face to face with his brother Soya. Soya taunts Hakuri, telling him Chihiro will abandon him, and under normal circumstances, that's obviously a ridiculous thing from the audience's perspective, because as we were just talking about, there was just a string of chapters developing Chihiro and Hakuri's relationship, and we've already seen in the previous arc that Chihiro's committed to helping and saving people. But, and maybe I am naive for this, I really did feel a bit of tension during this moment because in my opinion, it was really the first time that Chihiro's desire to help others was challenged in any way. In this case, by pitting it against his personal feelings and desires for revenge. I think the first arc really established these two things as the defining parts of Chihiro's character. Both his desire to help other people, but also one of his primary motivations being the death of his father. And so I really love this moment of Chihiro choosing to use one of his only remaining Cloud Gouger attacks to save Hakuri because A, I really did think there was decent tension built up to that scene, and B, it takes the character development we've had for Hakuri, which has been building since the beginning of this arc, and connects it to one of the more emotionally resonant moments for Chihiro's development in the series thus far, and a moment that both challenges his values and reaffirms who he is as a character. I love the writing of their relationship and how intertwined they are in this moment. I also very briefly want to mention Tenri before we take a deeper dive into another chapter I really wanted to talk about, that being chapter 35. But I really like the dynamic between Tenri and Chihiro, because it once again adds an extra dynamic to Chihiro's defining character traits, this time complicating his desire to help people. I know I don't have to spell it out for you guys because it's pretty self-explanatory, but he clearly wants to save everyone who's being sold at the Rakuzaichi, but his deep emotional empathy and compassion is still manifesting for Tenri, and as someone who for the most part has only been cold to his enemies, I thought this was a nice moment to show Chihiro's cold, badass, I'm gonna murder everyone exterior is a bit more complicated under the surface. I think we saw that a bit too in his final fight versus Sojo, but I thought that was more from a philosophical perspective. This was kind of a more emotional version of that in my opinion, so I thought it was neat. It sort of continues the trend too of the first arc giving us more of the basic ingredients that Hokazono is cooking with, and throughout the Rakuzaichi arc we really start to see the payoff of all of those things that were set up. Anyways, chapter 35 was the chapter that truly got me to confidently raise Kagurabachi as a series up a tier in my personal opinion. I love this chapter, and it may be my favorite chapter in the series so far, although there are a couple of chapters that come after this that are definitely in contention also. This one is the Hakuri backstory chapter, where we find out why he left the Sazanami family, and showing us his relationship with the girl who Soya referenced all those chapters back. Obviously, that moment of foreshadowing from Soya implied that we would get a chapter like this at some point, but I thought the execution was really good, and it, at least to some extent, subverted some of my expectations. I mentioned Soya's dialogue foreshadowing this chapter, and I want to go back to that momentarily because it adds important context to my thoughts on the chapter. Soya in chapter 24 tells Hakuri, quote, "The only reason you disobeyed the Sazanami family is because that merchandise woman tempted you and made you go crazy, right? Well, she's dead now, so you've woken up, right?" Which, funny enough, yes, Hakuri did wake up because of that, but in a different way. Now, in all fairness, this may be just because I was dumb and I wasn't reading it close enough at first, because Hakuri does say he ruined the merchandise, but to be fair, I think that is a bit vague, and I would say it's vague enough where you could probably put the pieces together of what actually happened, but there's still enough room for interpretation where it's not a certainty at this point in the series. Although we eventually find out for sure the Sazanami clan wouldn't kill their merchandise because that would conflict with the auction, which Kyora confirms when he's thinking to himself in his final battle with Chihiro. At this point in the story, given that Kyora had just threatened to kill the people in the storehouse if Chihiro were to try and fight him in the previous chapter, I think it was still on the table that the Sazanami clan killed her. I say that to say, we know she died, but we didn't know how she died. So seeing how it played out with her taking her own life, in part due to Hakuri's actions, or at least that's what Hakuri thinks is the case, was a genuine moment of surprise for me. And I love that the story, in going in this direction, avoids being reductive about the girl's situation. Obviously, she sympathizes, at least outwardly, with Hakuri, and I think some version of that is kind of necessary for Hakuri to have a change of heart. But she's not just a damsel in distress who, due to being a perfectly good person, pushes Hakuri to have a change of heart. I don't doubt at all that there was some truth to her words to him, but as we find out, yeah, she had her own ulterior motives. In depicting that, the series doesn't shy away from or arguably downplay the severity of the Sazanami clan's actions by having her just quickly and perfectly forgive Hakuri. It doesn't shy away from oversimplifying the trauma that she had to endure, which for her role in the story as a plot device to progress Hakuri's character could have been an easy thing to do. I also want to talk a little bit about the imagery because I saw a lot of people accurately point out that in some of the panels where we see Hakuri from her perspective, it looks like he's the one who's caged or behind bars. And that's definitely true. I think there's a line of dialogue in one of the future chapters too where Hakuri makes a similar observation, but I do want to add some commentary to that dynamic because I think it's also important to mention that while they are both shackled by the Sazanami clan in similar ways, they are, ironically, as Hakuri accurately points out in the beginning of the chapter to her, they're not equal. Despite being bullied relentlessly by his brothers and beat down constantly by his family, he still at this point tries to do what he can for them. He still tries to impress his father and do his part, as small as it may be, to keep the Rakuzaichi going without a hitch. And what the woman does in taking her own life not only serves to not cheapen her experience, but also to not let Hakuri off the hook for his involvement, as small as it may be. and we see and feel Hakuri's guilt so much more, especially as we see him thinking back, echoing in his mind the words that he said to her initially. I think that just makes it all the more powerful. This chapter also plays a pretty big part into the overarching themes we mentioned about socialization and how people and their beliefs are shaped by their environment. Hakuri, Tenri, and all the others being born into the Sazanami clan are raised to be this way, but the series does a really good job of not being reductive about that dynamic as well. While it's true that Hakuri only tries helping the Sazanami clan because he was born into and raised that way, it's also true that 1, he still does try to help them, and 2, he also only changes and is able to break free from that cage in large part due to chance and circumstance. He just happened to be treated poorly by his family in spite of his immense talent because they missed that he was a genius at sorcery, and only because of that was he able to meet the girl who changed his worldview. It's only because of his injuries due to getting mistreated by his brothers that he was able to find credence in the sympathy that she was expressing for him. I think Tenri is supposed to represent another version of what Hakuri could have been like if he was recognized for his talents, which is why they're depicted together so much in the flashbacks. As we see, Tenri turns out to be subservient and ready to give everything for the family. That's what Hakuri could have been. In fact, he initially was that way. I'm going to return to this thought later, but I think Hakuri recognizes these dynamics of socialization, and it's potentially a large part of the guilt that fuels him. It's not just a simple, oh, I was born into this way of thinking, but realized the error of my ways and I'm a good guy now. That rationalization can't be acceptable for him because she took her own life. Yes, he was raised to think that way, but because he was unable to save her. And had he been raised differently, for example, if he had been raised in the same way Tenri had been, he may have never even come to realize that to begin with, and would have continued to hurt her and more people like her. And that has to be a scary thought and one that's probably difficult to grapple with. But because he was broken from the cage in the way that he was, I think he was able to recognize those dynamics by looking at it from the outside. And it forces him to wrestle with those dynamics, his upbringing, his own probably genuine feelings of love for his family, and the ugliness of the traditions and his role in them. And it makes him such a compelling and emotionally impactful character. The very next chapter, of course, is Hakuri's awakening, which is also what you're watching me draw. It's very cool, that's why I chose to draw it. But before we get back to gushing over the series though, I do want to be completely honest and offer one nitpick though. It's definitely nothing that ruins the series, of course, hence the title of this video, and I love Hakuri, I want to make that clear. But I thought I should at least be fair and mention I do think his growth as a sorcerer did feel at least a little bit contrived in terms of how much of a genius he ended up being, with the Sazanami clan having had literally zero clue about it, even though Shiba was able to identify some talent in him. I get the explanation that they make judgments on talent way too early due to their traditional worldview, and there were some hints earlier with Shiba saying most normal people would die if they took the attack from Flamebone Hakuri did, and I understand the thematic implications, which I do appreciate and we'll talk about them, but I can't lie, I did think it felt at least a little bit convenient how powerful Hakuri got in as fast as he did, and also how much stamina he ended up having in that final fight. But like I said, the thematic implications of Hakuri's power-up are cool. There's the obvious one, which is how Chihiro and Shiba's treatment of Hakuri is rewarded, something that Kyora keeps thinking back to as he's losing the fight to Chihiro. But I do think it's important to emphasize also that while Shiba referenced Hakuri's potential aptitude for sorcery, he didn't know it was going to happen as drastically or as quickly as it did. Chihiro and Shiba didn't just treat Hakuri as an equal because they were better talent evaluators than the Sazanami, they did it in spite of believing he may be useless in their fights. Chihiro kind of admits to that at the beginning of chapter 37, and if you look at the end of the chapter when he's reflecting on his relationship with Hakuri, he's not talking at all about Hakuri's strength in a power scaling sense, he's thinking about Hakuri's ideals and resolve. That takes us, of course, to the end of chapter 37 and the beginning of chapter 38, and from this point on, the pace of the manga really picks up. It's pretty much banger chapter after banger chapter. There's one more big thematic discussion I want to get to, but for a moment, I just want to appreciate the aesthetics of this manga. In terms of just the cool factor, chapter 38 and beyond is awesome. The Chihiro vs Kyora fight is visually really cool. Hokazono's art is a huge part of this, of course, and we will get back to that, but even just stuff like Kyora controlling the storehouse and pulling grenades from out of nowhere, seeing Chihiro and Hakuri pull off surprise moves utilizing information that was previously given to us by having Chihiro infuse things with his spirit energy, and then having that culminate in the reveal of them attempting to save all the people from the storehouse, all adds up to make a very tense and fast-paced fight that's exciting to follow, with stakes that are emotionally relevant. Like I said, we've always known Chihiro wants to save people, and I think after having that ideal tested earlier in the arc, and also having Hiyuki there, who is a very likable character with similar ideals, and having seen intimately how messed up the Rakuzaichi is through Hakuri's backstory, it really helps us care more about Chihiro's desire to save everyone here, as opposed to, for example, the scene when he took the lightning attack from Sojo during the first arc. And I just mentioned Hiyuki, who I have not mentioned yet in this video, but the build up from her previous 2 fights with Chihiro really makes their team up so incredibly hype. She's a likable, charismatic, and cool character whose heart is in the right place, who's been put in opposition to our main character, so naturally seeing them team up together is incredibly satisfying, and will make it even more intense if they end up fighting against each other again in the future. Which, you know, at this point, who knows, because obviously at the end of the arc, Chihiro offers to join the Kamunami, so they'll presumably be on the same side, at least for a while, which I think is cool. I think the twist makes sense too, given the circumstances, specifically with the buildup regarding the Shinuchi, which, speaking of the Shinuchi or the Magatsumi, let's talk about it, because the buildup for this sword has been amazing. We've only seen a glimpse of what it can do, and it already looks completely insane. The insect motif really adds to the menacing and creepy vibe of the blade, and the art on some of these panels where Kyora is using its powers is breathtaking. I love the butterfly wings when he first uses the blade, or the flowers. So many of those scenes are just really cool. But y'all know that already, because y'all have probably read the chapters also. I just wanted to share in my excitement with y'all. Anyways, let's bring it back down to earth a little and tie the end of the arc back to the major themes that we've been talking about so far. And I say let's tie it back to those themes, but really it's Hokazono who very beautifully ties those themes into the end of this arc. Earlier, we were examining socialization with respect to Hakuri's character arc, but now let's take a look at it from the perspective of his father, Kyora. He is clearly a giant asshole who seemingly does not care at all about his kids, given his treatment of Hakuri and all the stuff surrounding Tenri's sacrifice. But I think it's important to point out that he's not just doing it because he's a selfish person and only cares about himself. He truly believes the things that he was telling his kids about their duty to the Rakuzaichi, and he embodies them. That's not to say he doesn't have any degree of selfishness, but I do want to point out what the series chooses to highlight about his motivations. At the end of chapter 39, when Chihiro inflicts a fatal wound to him, he's not really thinking about himself. He's thinking about the auction. The Hishaku leader pretty much says the same thing in chapter 40 when he says Kyora lives for the Rakuzaichi. Then there's the flashback where he thinks back to his wife, who says that maybe he wouldn't have been such a bad person if it weren't for the Rakuzaichi, making it clear that Kyora, even though he is perpetuating the cycle, is just like anybody else in that he is also a product of his circumstances. On that note, when Chihiro comments about him and Hakuri fighting evil, they're not just fighting an evil individual. It's multiple centuries of tradition and socialization that put these individuals in situations where they perpetuate evil. And like I said with Hakuri earlier, that does not at all absolve Kyora. He is still evil. But the added context conveys that there is a generational weight to this climactic battle that I think Hokazono does a beautiful job of depicting. And I think it resonates to a lot of people who see these family dynamics at play in their own lives. Family roles, family duty, tradition, and how the weight of those pressures suppresses and wears on individuals. I know because I've seen some of that in my life, and I think it's conveyed very well in this arc. I think it's also worth having a more nuanced discussion on how that hold is so strong outside of just the ideology having lasted for a long time and it being tradition. I mentioned roles and duty, 2 words that by themselves have a pretty monotonous and dry connotation, but they don't exist in a vacuum, right? These roles and duty are supposed to be roles and duty for the family. And family, at least nominally speaking, is supposed to be founded on love, which of course we see Hakuri struggle with, as well as Tenri, and even Chihiro is motivated by that. Kyora himself uses the language of love as justification, as we see in the flashback in chapter 34, where he tells Tenri and Hakuri, quote, "Blood alone is a cold, lonely connection. I love you too. Because we have that bond, we can never truly be separated." That's a quote that's reminiscent of something a protagonist would usually say, not the main antagonist of an arc. And it's just an interesting reminder that these people are evil, but they're still human beings, and thus at some level have human motivations. And so these traditional values that in this case are very harmful is also whitewashed in part by a logic and language of love which has been twisted to perpetuate this tradition. They aren't just carrying out a duty for the sake of carrying out a duty, but rather that duty is intertwined with a misguided sense of love. The thing that I think is maybe the most poetic of all of it though is Hakuri's role in this fight and how it relates to those themes. Earlier I said we would revisit his recognition of the environmental factors that shaped who he is. Shiba points out that Hakuri bets on Kyora's devotion to the Rakuzaichi to make the call that he'll be able to keep the storehouse alive long enough for Chihiro to save everyone who's still trapped. And what better way to end this ugly, centuries-old tradition of evil than for the guy who was able to escape from and see from the outside and know better than anyone else how strong those social dynamics were that shaped him and the rest of his family, to weaponize that knowledge to take advantage of Kyora's fundamentally human rationalization for evil in the saving of all those people who would have otherwise been harmed by that tradition. Monsters are not always just monsters by default, with no other possibilities for them to have become something else. They are molded to be so, and while that does not excuse their actions, understanding that dynamic, as Hakuri does, shows a possibility for the outcome to be different. I think that's beautiful. And so Hokazono, through Hakuri, shows the power in recognizing, grappling with, and challenging social dynamics. More specifically, he shows that knowledge and the ability to see and reflect on one's circumstances and the circumstances of those around them is also the power to change evil that's backed by centuries of people, perhaps understandably, but uncritically continuing said tradition. And it's also the power to save the people that have been burdened by that logic. And of course, Hakuri being put in that spot because he too was harmed by those traditions is also very poignant. And though I'd say it affected him less than those who were actually being sold in the auction, remember, his father still did treat him as merchandise when he traded him for Enten. I'm definitely curious to see whether this kind of dynamic will resurface in dealing with the evil in some of the future arcs, or if it'll mostly be a feature of this arc since it is a bit more intimate due to focusing on the family of a character who we really care about in Hakuri. But I do hope to see it explored a bit more, maybe at a national level or something like that, who knows. Definitely if it does come up again, and maybe even if it doesn't, I may revisit this theme and do a deeper dive into it in a standalone video, probably drawing on more real-world examples with respect to family and tradition in East Asian cultures, such as Japan, but we'll see. Maybe it'd be a fun thing to revisit if/when we do get an anime adaptation or something like that, but it's definitely a theme that resonates with me, so definitely don't be surprised if I come back and retackle this topic at some point. Also, quick maybe fun fact that I will preface by saying that while I have a very rudimentary knowledge of Japanese, I'm definitely no expert in the language, so this is totally outside of my wheelhouse, and I would not be able to speak to the nuances of the etymology of Hakuri's name, but according to the Kagurabachi wiki, as well as a few of the translators and Japanese dictionaries that I've looked at, one of the characters in Hakuri's name means reason or logic or justice or truth or something like that. Once again, way outside my wheelhouse, but I thought it might be a fun fact that was worth mentioning. And if there's anyone out there who is an expert or knows enough about Japanese to give their opinion or interpretation on that, I would love to hear your take on it as well. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Kagurabachi so far. I love the characters, I love the art, love the action, the plot is interesting, and I love that so far. I'm not going to say it's the most complicated story of all time or anything like that, but I have enjoyed and been pleasantly surprised by the series' willingness to not oversimplify, and this series has really gained my trust. Even stuff like the panel at the end of chapter 41 where you have Hiyuki, Kyora, and Chihiro all saying the enchanted blades belong to different people, and while obviously Hiyuki and Chihiro are more aligned ideologically, I think there are or maybe were, because technically they're on the same side for now. Meaningful differences in their ideals, and both come from valid perspectives. If anyone made it this far though, thank you so much. I plan to do a video like this at the end of every arc, but, and I kind of referenced it earlier, I definitely want to make videos about specific topics as well when something comes up that really interests me. They're just a bit harder to work on because the series is ongoing, and when covering full arcs, there's a structure I can follow that helps me work through my thoughts. I don't want to promise anything because who knows if I'll be able to deliver, but I do want to cover other series as well. I plan to do a Boruto video at some point. I'll probably cover JJK when it ends, and I really want to do a video, and I've been wanting to do this video, just have to sit down and do it, but the relationship between Attack on Titan, the origins of the kaiju genre, and the aftermath of World War II, but that is going to take a lot of work, so I don't know when it's happening. It'll happen at some point though. We do have a video in the works coming relatively soon though, next couple of months or so, which is going to be a video essay on video game soundtracks, which will include an exploration of some of the honestly pretty interesting history of it. Script and narrating, not done by me, but by my good friend Wolfman instead, although I helped edit that script. So look forward to that if you're interested. That's just going through the editing process right now. We're trying to do our best to get this channel off the ground right now. So if you liked what I had to say, or maybe you enjoyed my drawing, please like, comment, subscribe, and follow us on our other social media platforms, which you can find in the comment section, or rather description below. We'll be posting analysis and art, so if you think you'd be interested in that, please check that out. We would greatly, greatly appreciate it. Thank you all so much again, and bye.